Hi everyone, we are here for Cooking with Drupal 11 recipes for membership organizations. A thank you for all of our sponsors, without whom we would not be here. So today we are going to look at a number of things. So first, say a little bit about myself, then we're going to talk about like the concept of recipes, high level. Then we'll dive in, get detailed about recipes. Then we'll talk about recipes specifically as it relates to membership organizations. Then we will mop the floor after we're done cooking, get some dessert, and I'm going to reveal something about the Drupal membership organization platform, or MOP. And then I'm going to welcome lots of questions. But I do welcome questions throughout the talk, so please don't be shy. Just be loud and clear. Okay, so I say I am a trainee chef when it comes to recipes because, well, first of all, recipes haven't been around for all that long. And secondly, I've only been looking at them for a few weeks. So this is me. Okay, that's not me, but it's some cool stock photography. That's me. And my name's Leonard. I'm a freelance Drupal technical architect. I've got 18 years of Drupal experience. I was involved in organizing Drupal Camp NYC and the Drupal NYC meetups, and I was on the board of the Drupal NYC nonprofit, but now I live in Austin, Texas. And actually, I used to live up the street here in Oakland over a decade ago, and I went to Bad Camp 2011. It was my first Drupal conference, so happy to be back here. And I'm president of my local neighborhood association, which is kind of what got me thinking about membership organizations and how they have a lot of common needs. And I'm the project lead of the Drupal membership organization platform. But I'm brand new to recipes in Drupal, and I submitted this session to force myself to learn. So learn with me and see how much I haven't learned as well. Okay, so what are recipes? So Dries says recipes bundle years of expertise into repeatable, shareable solutions. This slide I graciously stole from the open source Drupal Starshot slide deck, and it talks about recipes. It says automated site building steps that are applied to a site. And this is new in Drupal 10.3. You can install modules, themes, import configuration, perform configuration actions. Recipes don't have their own code or their own upgrades. And there's a little table here, which I think is a helpful comparison between recipes and install profiles. So install profiles have a sort of storied history in Drupal. And this first row in particular about lock-in, I think, is key. When you install Drupal using an install profile, you're stuck with it. You can't get out of that install profile. You might use the minimal profile. You might use the standard profile. You might use something bigger, maybe Commerce Kickstart, which I think you're not supposed to use, but a lot of people do, right? And you run into problems down the line because now you're dependent on all of the dependencies of this install profile, and you can't sort of upgrade and downgrade easily unless the install profile actually is maintained and kind of lets you do those things. With recipes, that's not a problem. So recipes, first of all, you don't have to install recipe when you're installing Drupal, although you can. You can install a recipe at any point in the life cycle of the website. Also, you can install more than one. So you're not limited to one like you are with an install profile. So that means they're kind of composable in some ways. You can add a bunch together. And recipes also have a concept of depending on other recipes. So there's some inheritance there where you can build one recipe that builds upon another recipe that builds upon some other recipe. So there's a lot of power here. Okay, so about the CMS installer, the Drupal CMS installer that's been, demoed, previewed, whatever you want to call it, at DrupalCon. Dries says, an installer that lets users install recipes, pre-built features that combine modules, configuration, and default content for common website needs. And so here's a screenshot from that Dries Note demo that shows the installer. So this is the Drupal CMS, this new future product, Drupal CMS. And if you see these, it's not going to show my cursor, but there are these buttons sort of in the middle, right, that you can toggle on and off. Multilingual support, accessibility tools, events, advanced SEO tools. These are recipes. That's the concept. So here you are installing Drupal, and you are presented to optionally select any number of recipes that you would like to install as part of your installation of Drupal. So the recipes initiative, so this is a Drupal core initiative that supports that Starshot initiative, which introduces Drupal CMS, which leverages Drupal core and some of the best of Contrib. And for more on Starshot, because there's a lot to talk about there, come to the Drupal CMS Summit tomorrow. Okay, so there are sort of 3 identified phases of the recipes initiative. So we're complete with phase 1, and the main aim of phase 1 was to create the ability to apply a recipe in Drupal. So 4 new APIs were added to core in Drupal 10.3 as experimental, very important. And I'm not sure if this is exactly part of phase 1, but the standard install profile was also recreated as recipes. So you can now go in and actually install Drupal from the standard recipe instead of the standard install profile, which lets you get all the same things as the standard install profile without the limitations of being locked into that install profile forever. So let's look at those 4 new Drupal core APIs. So there's a recipe, so that provides support for applying a recipe, and that depends on the 3 other new APIs. The second one is config action, so that provides support for plugins that manipulate configuration. There's config checkpoint, which provides the ability to roll back config changes. So for example, if you were to apply a recipe and it only partially applies, that's going to put your site into a weird state. You don't want that, so the ability to roll back and sort of undo what has just been done in that kind of failed state. And finally, default content. So this comes from the default content Contrib module, but now it's being incorporated into core, and that lets you basically import content from files, like in a recipe. Okay, so phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 2 is ongoing right now, and the main aim is to refine and improve the recipe system to be used in Starshot in Drupal CMS. And some things that are going to be done in phase 2 that are planned, help end users find recipes on Drupal.org, in the project browser and in the installer. Actually create those config checkpoints to allow recipes to be reverted during the application when you're applying the recipes. Unpack recipes using Composer and just generally make recipes work better with Composer. Add and improve config actions, which we're going to talk about more. Validate recipes and configuration, and add more core recipes. Among other things, that will include converting the Umami demo install profile into 1 or more recipes. And then phase 3, the main aim is to create tools for recipe creation. So UI tools, CLI tools, and this is a big pain point right now if you're actually trying to create a recipe, is there's not a lot of tooling to help you do so. Okay, so we're going to dive into recipes and how you can cook with them. Okay, so baseline, what's a recipe? Well, it's a recipe.yaml, that's .yml, it should be just .yml file, plus optional dependencies, configuration actions, and or content. All those things are optional, right? But you do have to have a recipe.yml file. It does not contain code, so a module or a theme can ship with code. A recipe cannot. It can be applied to a site, but we don't say it's installed. And you can do that, as I said, at any point in the site's lifecycle. And you can remove a recipe, but you can't remove the effects of having applied the recipe. So once you apply a recipe, it performs a bunch of changes on the site, right? As if you were a site builder making changes in the UI. And then if you remove that recipe, all you're doing is removing that directory that had that YAML file and other pieces of the recipe in it, but all those things that the recipe did to their site have still been done. There's not a way to undo that or uninstall the recipe. Recipes do not restrict upgrading, downgrade, or uninstallation of dependencies, unlike install profiles. That gets kind of that locked-in concept we were talking about earlier. And a recipe does not support upgrade paths. And so this is going to be a pain point for recipes, sort of a limitation. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Recipes are composable with other recipes, so you can build upon other recipes. And recipes are shareable. You can share a recipe. That's kind of the point. You share a recipe so somebody else can benefit from it, right? And take advantage of all the things you configured on your site without having to do it themselves. So some use cases for recipes include installing dependencies, applying configuration, or importing content across multiple sites. So different people have use cases where they maintain lots of sites that all use sort of a common base, and they want to apply changes across all those sites. You can use recipes to do that. You can use recipes in lieu of or in addition to an install profile, but I don't see a lot of use cases for continuing to use install profiles going forward because of the limitations we discussed. You can build website starter kits. So for example, a pre-configured blog website or a conference website, or a lot of agencies have like a base install or base set of modules and things they install for all their client websites. You could use a recipe to create that. And you can use recipes as common building blocks for other recipes. Okay, so the structure of a recipe. We already talked about that recipe.yml file, and that's in a folder. There's a folder for every recipe. And then you've got all the optional things. So composer.json, this is a good idea to include if you are going to share your recipe, because it allows somebody to point to a source code repository using their composer, pull down your recipe, and actually benefit from it. That's also where you'll put any dependencies that you want pulled in. Right? So if your recipe requires some other packages, it requires that modules are available or present, right, to be installed, you're going to want to use Composer, going to want to require those in your composer.json. You can also suggest other packages that could be useful, just like in composer.json normally, and you can suggest other recipes. So maybe you have a recipe and there's some sort of related recipes or sort of other recipes that build upon that one. You can suggest them without actually causing them to be installed or applied. And what else? Okay, so there's a config directory. So this is where any configuration that you just want to be applied when your recipe is applied can go. There's a content directory. That's where you stick exported content that you want to be imported as part of a recipe. And you can include a logo image file that will be exposed as part of the project browser, part of Starshot. That's all I know. And that these recipes go in a recipes folder, which belongs at the top level of your repository above your web root, so adjacent to where you would typically have your config and vendor folders. Okay, so in the recipe YAML file, things that you need to have there include a name, a description, and a type. That's a categorization, kind of just like a module. You know how it groups the modules in the extend page? Same idea. And then you can optionally specify other recipes to apply. And so that's the first thing that recipe, the recipe runner does, is it goes and looks at any other recipes that you want to apply, and it will apply those. Then any modules and themes to install. And as part of that, it will include any of their simple configuration. Excuse me. Then you can specify configuration to apply. And so you can use wildcard to import all of a module's configuration, or you can specify specific configuration from different modules that you want to be applied. Then you can specify configuration actions in your YAML file that will basically manipulate configuration in a lot of different possible ways. And then content to create. Okay, so config actions. So these are, remember, this is one of the new APIs that was added. And config actions are like conditional and sort of advanced logic for applying and manipulating configuration. So it's not just you take some configuration YAML and you stick it in your recipe and it gets applied. There's some sort of logic to it. So you specify what configuration entity you actually want to take action on. Then you specify the action that you want to take on it, and then any arguments that action requires for them to take effect. And we'll look at an example. But some examples of config actions include applying configuration only if it doesn't already exist. So you're not kind of reapplying something that has already been applied before. Changing a property of a config entity, like a label, for example. Adding a field to all bundles. Granting a permission to a role, or granting a permission to every role. So you can use a wildcard to do that. You don't have to actually know all of the roles that exist in order to have an effect on all of those roles. And there are already over 25 config actions written for Drupal core. I don't think all of those are in Drupal 10.3 and Drupal 11.0, but certainly I think they'll be part of Drupal 11.1. Okay, so content. The default content contrib module is your best way to export content from a website into a YAML file that you can then copy over into a recipe to ship it off to be imported on some other website. Right, so that's the concept of content and recipes. And there's a content directory, and that's where you place all of those YAML files of content that you want to be imported. And so it's very simple. The recipe will simply import whatever is in that directory. Okay, so to apply a recipe, there are two ways. So one is you can use just a script that ships with Drupal core. So that's core scripts Drupal, and then recipe. And then you specify the directory where that recipe lives. In this example, I'm showing you how to apply the standard recipe that we discussed earlier. And so there's sort of a special case for the Drupal core recipes because they ship with Drupal core. So they are not in that top level directory of recipes. They're in core recipes. So you'd have to specify that path. The other way is if you have Drush 13 or above, then you can do Drush recipe and then specify that recipe folder that you want to install. Sorry, I keep saying install. You don't install recipes. You apply them. I'm kicking myself every time I do it. You apply them. Okay. So limitations, we talked about some of these already. So recipes are not designed to be applied on production environments because they're actually modifying the configuration, and it's bad practice, right, to be modifying the configuration in your production environment. And as part of that, they can't be used to deploy content. They can be used to import content into an environment, right, but you wouldn't want to do that on a production environment. There are no upgrade paths. So if you develop a recipe, there's not an easy way to then develop a later version of that recipe that sort of upgrades you from having used the older version of the recipe to the newer version of the recipe. Because remember, it's not in a steady state. Once you apply a recipe, that configuration can be changed further. Somebody might go and change it. So a newer version of the recipe can't assume anything about that older recipe having been applied. So your best bet is to use config actions to sort of add the conditional logic to make sure that whatever that recipe needs to do, it sort of accounts for when it's applied, regardless of whether it has been applied in some form or version in the past or not. There's no way for you to know whether a recipe has been applied in the past, right? The recipe doesn't know that. It just does whatever the recipe says it should do. So it does require a bunch of manual effort to create recipes now because we don't have any tooling in the UI or the CLI, like they're no particularly useful Drush commands for a lot of these, getting a lot of these things. So you have to export configuration, using config export, and then copy and paste the pieces of the configuration that you want into your recipe. And that's relatively straightforward if you're just copying an entire a YAML file of configuration from your sync directory in, on a site over to a recipe. But it gets much more complicated when you actually want to use config actions because now you have to take bits and pieces of configuration and include them in your recipe.yaml file itself and get the indentation right and apply the actions, and there's just a lot more to be done. So big opportunity there, right, for these tools to help make that a lot easier. You may be familiar with features from Drupal 7, that module, which originally was designed for actually creating things sort of like recipes, right, that could go and be applied to other websites, and it got kind of taken over to be used as configuration management in general. But there's talk of maybe the features module might make a comeback in some way to help you create recipes again. We'll see. There's I think a lot of this is TBD. You can't currently host recipes on Drupal.org, but that is planned, and so that makes it hard to actually discover recipes because where do you look? And so, there'll be progress made there. Also, there are limited recipes available to be built on. Yes?
Recipes can be posted on Drupal.org as general projects.
They can be hosted as general projects?
There's not yet a specific recipe content type.
Okay.
With module theme and the others.
That's interesting. I thought I'd read that you're not supposed to, but I don't know if that's true. It seems to me like most people are hosting recipes on GitHub. But
CMS is a general project on Drupal.org.
Interesting. Many things I don't know. Okay, so let's go on. Let's talk about recipes for membership organizations. So first an aside, what is a membership organization? Well, I'm defining it as just an organization that has members, right? Pretty simple. Often these are not for profit, but they don't have to be. And now I'm going to encourage everybody to think about a membership organization that you are or have been a part of. Does everybody have one? All right, so on the count of three, I want you to all yell out your membership organization names. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Association.
Perfect. So I heard all these examples. I heard some clubs and some professional associations. I think there were some civic groups in there. Definitely there was a religious organization, some service clubs, and maybe some other nonprofits thrown in there, right? So lots of different organizations stand to benefit, from working together on some common set of functionality, maybe with a recipe. So we're going to look at two very simple sample recipes. The first one I'm calling Membership Manager, and this is about as simple as it gets. All it is a role, right? It's a whole recipe that just has a role in it. Why would you make a recipe with just a role in it? The reason you would do that is because you might want other recipes to build upon that recipe and be able to work on a kind of a common framework or common understanding of what configuration exists, so recipes can be interoperable, right, with one another. So this is a contrived example, but you could create a membership manager role that is then used by other recipes. The other one is a very simple member database, just to track members and past members. You'll see how basic it is. So first, that membership manager recipe. So here is the recipe.yaml file, and all this is saying is the name, description, and type. Membership, I just made that up. It's for categorization, right? And that you want to install, make sure the user module is installed, because we're creating a role which depends on that. I'm not 100% sure if that's strictly necessary. It might depend on some things, but I added it there just to be safe. So let's switch over to a browser here. I can figure out where it went. All right, where's the duplicate button? All right, we'll do it another way. No, you know what? Actually, let me continue with this, and I'll come to it after the second recipe. Whoop. Doesn't like me. Come on.
Use Alt-Tab or something.
Huh. I don't know what it's doing. Oh, something is off.
endangered live demos.
That's it. It's not even letting me drag the window now. Huh. All right, well, see if I can make do with the window as is.
It gets stuck sometimes.
What's that?
It does get stuck sometimes.
Hmm.
Oh, we try to go to the edge of the window and try to drag it, like the browser.
Yeah, I tried that. It's not letting me. It's like something's blocking it. All right, let me try adjusting the display. Here we go. Bear with me.
Will it be on?
You know, I think Chrome might have crashed. Yeah, I'm gonna have to shut down Chrome here. It's not working. Knew I should have exported it as a PDF. All right, we're back. We're going to talk about the second recipe, and then I'm going to show them together. That'll be a little easier. So the second recipe is that very simple member database, and so this depends on that membership manager recipe. And as I said, there might be other recipes that also depend on it so that they can work well together. And this member database recipe simply provides a storage entity type called person with accompanying fields. And I'll note that a better design might have depended on another recipe that provides a person entity type, right? Because there might be other recipes that also deal with people, and why would we have more than one, person entity type? It doesn't kind of make sense. And so this is one of the challenges that I think the Drupal community is going to encounter is how do we, it's the same thing with modules, right? But how do we work together to make sure that we are all depending upon common recipes so that our the recipes we're creating are better together. This recipe provides permissions for the membership manager role to actually manage those person entities. It provides a member list view to list the members, and it provides some menu links for easy access to that new view and for adding a new member. Okay, so let's look at that YAML file, the recipe.yaml file for the member database. So we've got name, description, and type. Then we've got recipes. So this is saying, please apply the membership manager recipe before anything else happens. Then make sure the menu link content, storage, toolbar, user and views modules are installed. And then continued here, we've got a config action. So the config action that we're adding here is grant permissions. And we're granting those permissions to the membership manager role. Now, this recipe knows the entity ID for this membership manager role because it's part of the recipe that it depends on, right? So I didn't just make this up, right? I know about this because I'm depending on a recipe that provides it. And that's why I'm confident that this will work. All right, so let's switch over to demo mode. And I'm going to just basically wipe this install. It's just a standard install of Drupal 11, 11.0.5. And let's go over to, does that need to be bigger?
Yes.
Yes, thought so. Even more? We'll go even more. Okay, so this is composer.json for my website, right? And ignore that first repository there. We might talk about that later. But I've added in the repositories section of composer.json reference to these two recipes on GitHub repositories. What I haven't quite figured out is why I need to reference both of the recipes on my site. I think it has to do with this other package up here about unpacking recipes, but I haven't 100% figured that out yet. So things are still a little difficult to figure out. But yeah, and there's not much else in here. I have drush, and I have required the member database recipe, so that second recipe. Okay, so that's basically all I've done to the site so far. And now I am going to probably make this bigger. Whoop. All right, not sure why it's doing weird characters here. So I'm going to apply a recipe. So I'm saying drush recipe, and then I'm referencing that member database recipe directory, which is in the recipes directory at the top level of my repository, just above the web root. And I'm going to hit return there. And it's going to be done pretty quickly here. And it says, OK, member database recipe applied successfully. So it basically went and did all that site building, right, that I could have done to replicate this myself automatically. And so now if I go, I'm going to be logged out. OK, so I'm going to log in here. And I'm going to log in just as admin. And this is a contrived, simple example, so forgive me. But I'm going to go to people, and I'm going to add a user with that new role. So we'll call it membership manager. And it has the role membership manager. Now remember, that role shipped with the first recipe, which was required by the second recipe. OK, so create the account. I'm going to log out of admin and then log in as membership manager. And we will see here that I have an add member link. So that was content that was imported. It's a menu link content that was imported. And that just basically provided a way to get to the storage entities module path that lets you add an entity, create an entity. So I'm going to add myself here, and I'm going to say I'm a current member, and hit save. Now, I've got this member list link up here. So this is the view. Uh-oh, that's not good. Oh, I know what this is. Anybody? Anyone want to guess? It's the cache. Clear the cache, and everything will be fine. So there's still some bugs with recipes. Remember, it's experimental. And so this is just a very simple view, right? Nothing much here. But you can imagine that if you could build this out and provide something a little more substantial for different organizations to manage their members. Maybe they're using a spreadsheet, right? Maybe it's just chaos, right? Maybe they've got some other system, but this could live in Drupal, and then you can leverage that membership database for other things on your site, right? Okay, so let's go back to the deck here. Oh, actually, before we do, let's go to look at the recipes themselves in the folders. Here's that recipes folder at the top level, and we've got that membership database recipe. which has a recipe.yaml file, composer.json, and it has a content and a config directory. So the config directory, this is configuration that I just basically copied out of a site after I did a bunch of site building activities and then exported it, but just the pieces that are relevant for the recipe, right? And I had to go in and manually kind of pluck out the ones that I wanted, because again, there's no useful tooling yet, not a lot of it. Then the content directory has a subdirectory per entity type, and so this is menu link content, and so it's not very pretty, right? But this is the YAML that gets generated when you use the default content contrib module to export content from your site. And so it's here, it gets imported. All right, so let's get back to our show here, if it'll let me. Presenter view is useless in this mode, isn't it? Okay, here we go. Okay, so some more hypothetical recipes, right? I didn't go and build these. It'd be a lot of work, I found out. Too much work. But imagine membership organizations, they use email newsletter services like MailChimp, right? To send out maybe segmented emails to different groups. Well, if you've got a membership database of your current members in Drupal, you could build something similar in Drupal and say, forget MailChimp, right? I'm going to build an email newsletter tool that allows you to email just current members or just members who were members last year but aren't members this year, right? To kind of target your communications a little more. And you could ship that as a recipe, right? So that other orgs could use it. Or maybe something much more complex, some e-commerce capability to actually accept membership dues and deal with things like different types of memberships for an individual or a household or a business membership, different durations, because every organization works differently. Maybe they have monthly, maybe annual memberships, maybe it has to be a calendar year, right? There are a lot of permutations out there. And maybe a recipe for meeting records, right? A lot of nonprofits and stuff, they've got a board, they have to have their meetings, they need to have their minutes, their agendas, and maybe they need to publish this on their website, right? Let's standardize it. So just some ideas. All right, let's take a little breather. Is anybody a little bit inspired? Can somebody think about a recipe, set of features that would be useful for maybe that membership organization that you thought of back when I had you scream at me? Yes?
You mentioned that your membership manager might want to work with spreadsheets. So you might want to have a recipe that can import CSV files into your website and create users.
Absolutely. So the suggestion was a recipe to maybe import and export membership records from the website to kind of sync that up and let you work with that data in a tool that you're familiar with, like Excel. Cool. Anyone else? Yeah.
Apologize if this is too specific, but for me and my team, what I imagine this being useful for us is every time we spin up a new site, we need to go through specific themes and modules that we know we need to install every time. But I have a question, because for our menu system, we need to npm install packages that aren't managed in Composer and then move those into specific directories. Would this be able to handle that part of that?
That's a great question, and I have no idea. The question for the recording was effectively, can you use npm install and manage your front-end dependencies as part of a recipe? Does anybody have the answer to that? Is the answer no, or is the answer I don't know?
I'm pretty sure the answer is no.
Kidding, probably no.
Because NPM have covered so many issues. Okay, something is stuck as some dependency. Okay, it looks as working, but...
Yeah. The only thing I can think of maybe is you could include in your composer.json some sort of script that gets run, right, when that recipe is, well, yeah, when you require that recipe or something. I'm not an expert on composer.json, but I think you could wrangle up some way to maybe trigger some of those npm.
Oh yeah, it's easy. Like if you look at npm install the script, then I think the script. Then you'll call it JSON file and then all of it.
Yeah, so you could ship shared scripts in that way. In the back?
If it would be nice to configure JSON API to match your content types. So I don't know if you could really spin up the front, but it would be nice.
Yeah, so the suggestion was it would be nice to be able to spin up JSON API for your content types.
Well, as one of the organizers of this event here at now, I edited the badcamp.org site a bunch of times, and almost everything there seems like it's all been done before. Like, in example, we had sponsors for this, so it seems roll off log that you could create a sponsors recipe that would have levels and
Yeah. So the suggestion was for a conference website, a sponsor's recipe, sort of a common building block. And there is there's an effort to make a contributed, or to make a core recipe, or I don't know, a recipe part of Drupal CMS specifically for events websites that likely would include that. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. We're done cooking for the moment. We're going to mop the floor, and for dessert, I'm announcing the Drupal Membership Organization Platform Project, or MOP, with this wacky logo here. Thanks to AI. AI is wondrous. This is a Drupalicon-inspired, mustachioed mop monster. And MOP is a new project to provide content management, membership management, meeting management, and communication tools to membership organizations, particularly those with little financial means and low technical resources. So this project is vaporware. We're in the ideation stage right now. It's just in our heads right now. And MOP is a working title until a more marketable one is decided upon. Also, there's already a MOP machine name project on Drupal.org, so we can't use that. Very high level goals is to serve organizations with low financial means, require only basic computing skills. So I'm coming at this from my involvement with my local neighborhood association. I'm the youngest and by far the most technically capable person, right, volunteering with the neighborhood association. Everyone else is retired, and they can't manage a website easily. But they can use Gmail, they can use Google Docs, Microsoft Word, and so it needs to be a tool that they can use. And the idea is to develop an open source Drupal-based solution that anyone technical can contribute to or extend, and also to foster collaboration among organizations to reduce their total workload and ensure a sustainable solution that organizations can keep using. So next steps for this are to identify more collaborators. We've already got a bunch of people who are interested, but I'm actively seeking anybody who wants to contribute to step forward. We need to validate some draft requirements that we have, solicit additional requirements, and then prioritize them. Then we need to implement the platform, right, as a minimal viable product, something that is actually usable, that an organization would say, I'll use that. And then we need to market it. We need to get the word out and get more people using it, more people contributing to it. So this is my call for collaborators. You can snap the QR code with the mop monster there, and that will take you to the Slack channel, Drupal Slack channel, mop-membership-organization-platform to collaborate. You don't have to have technical skills. We need people of all sorts, because as you can imagine, we talked about a lot of different features and things that could be done. There's a lot to do, right? But we have to start small. Okay, more questions. Season me with questions. I'll do my best to answer them. What do we have? Yes, sir.
So, in sort of previous config management, if you were to import some config and it already existed, you get an error. What about recipes? How did it handle that?
So the question was, if you try to import import a recipe and the configuration already exists, will there be an error? And so the answer is it depends on how you do it. So if, like the recipe I showed, you kind of take a bunch of configuration YAML and you just stick it in the config directory, you can run that recipe once. If you run it again, it's going to error out because the configuration already exists and it doesn't like that. And that's where you would maybe choose to use config actions, where you can do things like apply this configuration if it does not already exist, and then it's smooth. There's also something about maybe like a less, I don't know if this is the right phrasing, but there's like a less strict way of importing. people are actively looking, I think, at this problem of like, how can we make it so that recipes don't error out just because something already exists? So maybe there's more to come. Other questions?
So there's not an upgrade path. Is there any plans to make it?
So what I mean about not an upgrade path is, I mean, for any given recipe that you create, there's not an easy way to upgrade from like an older version of that recipe to a newer version of the recipe. Basically because you can't control what has happened in the interim, right? It's not like a module where the module is installed and it stays installed and you know it's installed and you know the version, and thus you can have update hooks that say from this version to this version you need to do these things to kind of bring it up to date. There's not that kind of versioning with a recipe. And I think that's sort of intentional in some ways, because it's really designed more for getting something started and sort of quickly applying a bunch of configuration to save you a bunch of time up front, rather than focusing on the maintenance of that over time. But that's a challenge. And so one thing that I could see happen, for example, with the MOP project, is maybe there's some recipes involved with that, but it's not just recipes. There are probably some contributed modules that need to be developed that can support, things longer term, so that you can have upgrade paths around things. And then the recipes would be much more limited in their scope, right? They might be adding some default content or some example configuration of like different types of pages you might want, or different tooling you want configured. And so I don't know the answer yet for MOP, for example, of where that division should be, or like what makes sense. That answer the question?
Yeah.
Sort of. Yeah.
So in one slide it said that there was a function to roll back recipes if something goes wrong, but then later you said recipes can't be installed. So can you clarify?
Yeah. So the API was added to Drupal core to support snapshots of kind of configuration, so that in sort of phase 2 of the recipes initiative, work can be done so that when you are applying a recipe, if it fails partway through, you can back out. But it's not about uninstalling an entire recipe at some point in the future. It's really, I think, focused on that. But maybe there's probably more that can be done with that API that I am not aware of, and that certainly hasn't been built yet. But there's definitely potential to do things with that. One thing I've heard of is kind of like a site building recording feature. So, and this kind of gets to the tooling piece as well. So I'm on a website and I kind of say start recording, and I go do a bunch of site building and I say stop recording, and now imagine you can kind of export that, and maybe there's a config checkpoint API involved in some of those things.
Does a diff
I don't know.
between the two and maybe gives you the stuff that...
Something like that.
Right.
But I don't know about, the uninstalling piece.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you wouldn't want to necessarily uninstall content types if there's now content in them, right? That could be bad.
There's a lot of danger there, yeah. Yeah. All right, last question or two? We're feeling full?
Let me ask you, so we have a big install profile for the university, 1,000 websites and stuff. But a lot of the things I'm thinking of as recipes, they're really intertwined, right? So we have a person content type, and we have an article content type. Well, the article content type has entity reference to the person content type for like, professors who worked on that project or whatever, right? So would you still be able to install them separately and only inject if this other thing happens to be installed? Is that what those actions are all about?
Great question. I'll try to repeat something coherent into this microphone. It was a long question, but the question is, I guess, basically about you've got two different features or components or things that you're creating, and they maybe depend on one another.
But you may not want both.
You may not want both of them, or you may want to add one later or something. Does recipe support that? So the answer is yes, and the way it supports that is a concept of sort of optional configuration. So in the same way that a module can ship with optional configuration that is only applied if all the dependencies are met, The same applies to configuration that you ship with recipes. Similarly, you can use config actions to have conditional logic about kind of what gets installed, applied, excuse me. Yeah, so there's the capability there, but I think people are still figuring out kind of how to work this and what the best conventions are and best practices are. Yeah. All right, last question.
Is it stable in 11, or is it still experimental?
It is experimental, so
Still, okay.
yes, I believe so. I haven't seen anything announcing it as stable. Actually, I know it's not stable. It's experimental. Things are actively being worked on, and the expectation is the APIs may change, but there is a kind of internal agreement, I think, to provide a sort of upgrade path for any changes to those APIs or to make it less painful for somebody who does want to adopt recipes. Very good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.